our lives. As an artist collaboration, we've given shape and depth to some of the most complicated topics of our time, making them easily accessible for those who seek to understand. We've given voice and space to the stories that often go ignored. Please take a moment to consider being a patron, make a donation, or join Rockfin. Thank you. Well, hello.
Hello.
Hi, welcome to another edition of Pullquote.
Welcome to Pullquote.
How are you guys doing out there? I hope you're doing fine.
Let's say hello to Rockfin.
Yeah, all our Rockfin viewers.
And our Patreon viewers. Thank you for tuning in, and YouTube and Facebook and all the old standbys.
Twitteronomy.
And Twitter.
The Twitterati.
Mm-hmm.
So today we have another set of great guests.
Yeah, we're really excited about these two that we've been following for, gosh, I guess about a year now.
Yeah.
They wrote a book. They've been all over the place and have become more and more popular in the age of COVID.
Right.
And we're absolutely thrilled that they agreed to come on and speak with us.
Mm-hmm.
I know that my mother will be very excited to hear what they have to say.
Right.
So, hi, Mom. I hope you're watching.
Well, we've talked to somebody who has hosted them and that they've talked to, Dr. Andy Kaufman,
Mm-hmm.
who will be coming back again. But today we want to bring on Don Lester and David Parker. Don and David are longtime investigators of health and healing, the medical establishment and its harmful practices. Don and David have technical backgrounds in accountancy and electrical engineering, respectively. Their unbiased and non-dogmatic approach to their 10-year investigation, not tenure, but 10-year investigation of the medical establishment system helps them uncover the real nature and causes of human illness. Their logical approach enabled them to follow the evidence with open minds and discover the flawed information expressed by the medical industry. You can find out for yourself what they uncovered in their book, What Really Makes You Ill, Why Everything You Thought You Knew About Disease is Wrong. But to find out more about them and their work, we have them here today and on Pullquote. So welcome to Pullquote, Don and David. Hi.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Great to be with
Thank
you.
you so
Hello
much.
there.
We're so excited to have you on. Thank you so much. I know
It's a
many of
pleasure.
our followers may not be familiar with your work. So I think this will be a wonderful opportunity to learn about our bodies and what makes us really sick, and how this correlates in the age of COVID. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for inviting us, and we obviously sincerely hope that you enjoy the chat and that your audience does too. So
yeah, well,
I
that's
guess,
we want. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, yeah.
No, I was just going to say we can say a little bit about ourselves to start with, but
Please
not
do.
Sure.
not,
Yeah.
not to bore people, but because many people may know who we are already. But I think I like to address it early on, because I think one of the burning questions people might ask is, well, as you said in your introduction, that Dawn, although we're both retired from our respective jobs now, but Dawn was a qualified accountant and I was a qualified electrical engineer. And people may ask the burning question of, well, how come you're investigating and have investigated the medical system, because you're not doctors? And I suppose that's a fair question. But just to explain that, really, without going into too much detail, we used our training, our logical and intellectual skills, which we both had to use in the training that we'd done to do our particular jobs. And we used those facilities, those faculties, to investigate, as anyone can, to investigate anything. And as we often say to people, well, how do you think doctors or architects or pilots or anyone learns their job. They start from ground zero, as it were, and go to college, and they learn how to do it, whatever it is. Now, doctors did that, you know, they didn't spring fully formed from their mother's womb, as it were, as a doctor. They had to go and learn. And of course, like anyone going to college to learn anything, you believe, because you have to believe, what you're taught in college. And to pass your exams at the end of it, you have to regurgitate what you've been taught. And one of the things we had to investigate was how doctors are trained. And because we wanted to know how the medical system had got into the mess that it had, you know, because it was quite obvious to us that doctors are not evil people who set out to deceive and administer treatments to people which are going to do them harm. Although that is what is happening, you know, pharmaceutical products that they give to people do cause harm, in fact, even kill people. And the same with the vaccination. So we knew that wasn't because of intent with doctors. And so it had to be how they were trained. And sure enough, when we studied how they were trained and how we talked to doctors who were honest enough with us to say how they were trained, it was quite easy to see. I mean, basically, we found, and I'll be brief, we found that the colleges that doctors go to train are, for the most part, owned by the pharmaceutical companies. And the curriculum in the colleges is set mostly by the pharmaceutical companies. And the college libraries are stocked by the pharmaceutical companies. So you can see how the pattern develops. And so doctors are trained to really be pharmaceutical drug pushers, really, to be blunt about it. They were not given the ability in their training, and we asked them this, you know, if they were told, well, this virus causes that disease and this bacteria causes this other disease, they were never able to do any actual research themselves. They were never able to actually ask the question, well, how do you know that that virus causes this disease? They were not allowed to do that. So they had to just learn by rote, really, and take on board what they were told. And then they had to regurgitate those answers to pass their exam. You know, if they started to get smart about it and give different answers, well, they just failed. So you can see how the whole thing starts to fall apart. And of course, as we know from talking to doctors, while they're at medical college, they incur huge debts, and which they have to repay, of course. And so they're in a position where they don't want to rock the boat once they've got that MD certificate. They don't want to rock the boat and have that license taken away from them, because they've got to earn money to pay back their debt and to look after their families. So you can see the problems that they get into. So that, in short, is why doctors are blindsided, if you like, into believing that the germ theory is correct. I mean, it's still called a theory, the germ theory, and it's called that because it's never been proven. And I'm sure we'll get into that.
Yes. Yeah.
So we just used our logic because we were able to ask the questions that doctors weren't able to ask. We were able to do the research that doctors weren't able to do. So although it took us 10 years, so we actually spent longer studying the medical establishment than doctors do, because they can get their MD certificate in 5 or 6 years. We took 10 years to really look into it. So
yeah, were you looking into the mechanics or the system itself, like how they were educated, but also just like what was behind a lot of the things, as much as the medicine itself?
Well, there's obviously, because as I sort of indicated, because the whole system, college, lecturers, curriculum, libraries, were all owned and supplied by the pharmaceutical companies, you can see there's a vested interest there to sell pharmaceutical products. So it's really it's a brilliant marketing model, really, to make sure that they can sell these products, which don't actually cure anything. And I defy any pharmaceutical company to show me a product that actually cures something. So all as it does, their products just may mitigate the symptoms, but they don't cure anything. So you're always going to get a continuation of customers coming back for more.
Yeah.
Plus as well, as we all know, they're pharmaceutical products have a whole list of so-called side effects, which
Side
they like to call
effects.
side effects,
Yeah.
but they're direct
Yeah.
effects, So you end up with a whole stream of drugs, really, one
Yeah.
drug
Yeah.
trying to counteract another. So it's, as I say, it's a great business model from the pharmaceutical point of view, and something they're very keen to keep going. But
Right.
because they're not interested in people's health, but they're obviously using doctors who, through their miseducation about health, are the sort of front guys, really, and they're the ones who sort of will get the kicking, if you like, as people either become ill or die.
Right.
So it's a nice little buffer for the pharmaceutical companies. But fortunately, people are waking up to this and realize that what's going off, and this whole COVID thing, of course, has brought it more into perspective, where people have started to ask more and more questions and realize
Right.
that they've not been told the truth by the mainstream establishment in whatever format it takes.
Right.
Yeah.
With everything that you just said, is germ theory a racket? Is it, because we often, when people meet us in real life, or, through these interview sessions, we come right out and say that we're terrain theorists. We believe in the terrain theory, which is, I assume is where you're coming from as well. So
Yeah.
is germ theory an absolute racket?
Yes,
Is it a total fraud?
It
Okay.
is, because from our research and many other people have been saying the same thing over the past couple of years, particularly, there is no evidence that any so-called virus or bacterium is the cause of any disease. So it's never been proven that there are any pathogenic viruses or bacteria. So therefore, I suppose it's pretty fair to call it a racket. It's not necessarily intentional from the perspective of the doctors, although their training teaches them that there are infectious diseases, and there are more and more of them, and they're deadly, and they can cause lots of problems and epidemics and pandemics of various kinds all over the world. But the more we looked into them, the more we realised that there's no evidence for the germs, but there's plenty of evidence for other potential causal factors, although it's never a single other causal factor. There'll be plenty of other factors, combinations of factors, which goes back to what you refer to as terrain. Now, what's called terrain is not actually a theory, because that suggests that it's not proven. But there is more than enough evidence that the environment that our bodies come into contact with, whether external or even the internal environment of the body, is what is more has more influence over our health or lack of health. So the more sort of environmental sort of factors that are not helpful to our health that we're coming to contact with, or that we ingest, or are injected with, or we come into contact with, absorb, inhale, the more of sort of toxic agents that come into the body will affect the health of the body, cause damage within the body, and that's what generates the symptoms. So it's the terrain, but it's never one other factor, and that's what a lot of people look for. Well, if it's not a germ, what is it? Because they're looking for a single answer, and there is no simple single answer, because almost always it'll be a combination, and different people, each of us is different, and we have come into contact with different aspects, different factors that could, we breathe in, even within the same household, we're not necessarily in contact with the same factors, because it's not just the physical factors, it's also the emotional and the sort of stress factors, and different people react to stresses and things. So there are lots of combinations of factors that affect our terrain, whether it's sort of the internal terrain or what we're exposed to in the external environment, or terrain, if you like, as well.
But what we found, and what we discuss in the book, just to explain a little more about the factors that what really make you ill, to be fair to people, that's the first part of the title, we found in all cases that it was a combination of one or more of 4 factors. And briefly, they are the correct level of nutrition, overexposure to toxic materials, overexposure to electromagnetic frequencies, and long and prolonged stress. And those are the 4 factors. And we found that every illness, and we've investigated a lot of them, which are in the book. Whenever we investigated an illness, we found one or more of those 4 factors was the actual cause. We could never, ever find a germ of one sort or another to be the cause. And I mean, we did what a lot of scientists and doctors and researchers have done over the last 150 years, really, is we looked for the proof. We looked for the scientific papers that should prove where someone somewhere had been able to prove that this germ, whether a virus or a bacteria, has scientifically been proved to cause the disease. And those papers don't exist. There are all sorts in modern day papers appearing on the internet purporting to have proved that, well, we'll take COVID, that the coronavirus exists and is the cause of this disease that's supposedly sweeping the world. And there's been a lot of these papers supposedly produced by scientific groups. Now, whenever they're investigated, I mean, we've looked at some, and thankfully people like Dr. Andy Kaufman, Dr. Tom Cowan, Dr. Stefan Lanka, and a group of others have looked at these papers and found that basically they're fraudulent. You know, they not only do they not prove that the particular virus exists and is the cause of a disease, they use completely the wrong methodology anyway. And Dr. Stefan Lanka, who is a trained virologist, although he doesn't like to be called a virologist anymore, because as we all know, virology is not a science, it's just a procedure. But he's had the training, so he knows very well what virologists do, and he knows where the shortcomings are. And he's gone to a lot of trouble to do the same experiments that virologists do to prove a so-called virus exists. But he's added the control experiment, which virologists don't do. I don't know whether you want me to explain briefly what that entails. I can do that if you wish. But
go ahead.
Okay. Well, basically, and I'll try and be brief. Basically, if virologists are going to supposedly prove that a particular virus is the cause of a disease, they take a sample. They're supposed to take a sample from a sick person, okay, and put it into a petri dish in their laboratory. They then add various components to it, such as antibiotics, monkey kidney cell, and bovine serum. So there's a mixture of cells there and various other components that all go into this petri dish. And that's where the first problem starts, because in virology terms, they call that an isolation. Well, anyone can see that that's a complete contradiction to what the dictionary tells us. The word isolation means to separate one thing from everything else. So the first thing they do is mix it all up in a petri dish in the laboratory. So it's now what I would call a cocktail. It's not an isolation, but so that's where the problem starts. Now, then what happens is they leave that concoction for a few days, quite often up to 5 days. And when they come back to it, they see that all the cells in the monkey kidney cells and the bovine serum, which is blood taken from a baby calf, actually, that all those cells are dead. And they sort of say that's their eureka moment, where they say, oh, that proves that there was a virus in that sample we took because it's killed all the cells. They never seem to realize that, no, the cells have died because you've poisoned them with antibiotics and all this other stuff, and you've starved them to death over 5 days because cells need to be fed with nutrition. And if they'd taken the trouble to do a control experiment, which is what Dr. Stefan Lanka did, which is to take a second petri dish and put all the same concoction into it, but not put any so-called viral material from the sick person, and leave it for the same period of time, 5 days. And sure enough, when you come back, all the cells are dead in the monkey kidney cells and the bovine serum. And yet there is no viral particles, supposed viral particles, in that dish at all. So you get exactly the same result. So if virologists had done that, they'd be able to say, well, so our experiment doesn't prove anything. Our experiment doesn't prove that there was a virus in that sample we put in there. Everything dies anyway. But and that procedure was first sort of done on the records back in 1954 by a couple of doctors called Enders and Peebles, when they were trying to prove that a virus was the cause of measles, which they were unsuccessful in doing. And you can still get hold of those papers. We've got a copy of them. And you can see that even in that 1954 we're talking, in those papers, when they did that same experiment that I've just described, they said that it was inconclusive because there were other components in the test experiment which could have been the cause of all the cells dying. Well, yes, starving them to death and poisoning them were two causes. But anyway, but virologists have continued to use that same flawed methodology from 1954. So it's hardly surprising that they produce rubbish, really. I mean, nothing that comes out of a virology lab telling you that a new virus exists it's not based on anything scientific. It's just nonsense. And no one has been able to isolate a supposed virus from anything, a sick person. In fact, there's an interesting little story. I keep coming back to Dr. Andy Kaufman because I found it quite interesting. Him and Dr. Tom Cowan were invited to a seminar where there was quite a number of virologists, quite senior virologists. And Andy asked the head virologist, if we're calling that, head virologist, why is it that you've not been able to isolate a virus from a sick person? And the virologist's answer was because there's not enough viral material, and which begs the question, well, how is the person sick if there's not enough viral material? Because they tell us that the virus attacks the body, multiplies in the body, and makes the person sick. And yet this virologist is saying, but there's not enough viral material in a sick person to be able to take a sample. So not content with that, Andy said, well, what about if you took it from 2 sick people? No, still not enough. Well, 5. Well, no, 10. And it was going up into the hundreds. And by that time, the head virologist stopped talking to Andy and Tom. He realized he was making a complete fool of himself. But you can see what we're up against. You know, even the virologists admit they cannot take enough viral material as a sample from even 500 sick people. Well,
I think it went up to 1,000.
Yes,
10,000. It was a crazy number.
I'm being generous, really, because it's just so ludicrous. And yet they want us to believe that somehow this non-existent thing is making the person sick, even though you can't actually find any of it in them. And this is the ludicrous nature of virology and viruses supposedly making you sick. So I thought it was
Thank you for that explanation.
Well, it seems like there's a lot of mythology around all this stuff, especially when we got into the whole, thing with the masking and all that stuff. And it's like we made a little short video of like, basically like, we showed a chain link fence and a mosquito, and it's like, trying to keep, if you say, viruses are so as small as you say they are, then clearly they're, you can let a mosquito in through a chain link fence and you can let a virus in through your mask, right? Because it's like,
exactly.
So, but these mythologies tend to wash over people, and they don't like think about them at all. Like where the contradictions are.
Speaking of mythology, could you speak to how we were all labeled as like Typhoid Mary during the whole COVID fraud? We had to distance each other, and we were all secretly carrying a pathogen. Can you explain who Typhoid Mary is? To me, growing up and hearing the story, I always assumed that it was just a story about a poor woman who was scapegoated and then pushed to the margins of society, probably for some other reason. I never truly believed that she was the carrier of a deadly disease. So can you go into that? Because I think that would speak to this whole business that we're teaching the kids in school right now, which is that they are killing grandma and that they are responsible for everybody else getting sick. And I'd like to just address that, and hopefully we can put a stop to that kind of language.
Yes, I mean, in simple terms, what you said is absolutely correct. She was scapegoated. I mean, what the reason for her to have been scapegoated is apparently that she was working with plenty of people who were ill, and she never became ill. So they assumed that she must just be a carrier. But the fact that she didn't become ill, again, that's another side issue, which is what we've been dealing with for the last couple of years as well, which is the so-called asymptomatic carrier. To just sidetrack on that one, because that's so important. The definition of any disease, so-called disease, involves symptoms. So if someone doesn't have symptoms, they cannot have a disease. So if they are infected by something that is supposed to be causing a disease, then they must have that disease. Therefore, they must have those symptoms. So if they are infected by, or if they are claimed to be infected, or if a certain so-called pathogen is found in their bodies that they don't have the disease it's supposed to cause, then that cannot be a disease-causing agent. So that's one problem. And again, everyone's been talking, the last couple of years talking about asymptomatic carriers. It is a nonsense, because if you're asymptomatic, you are healthy. So that's one of the problems, because that they've used that story to help create this, again, as you say, myth of people who are housing these so-called pathogens and carrying and passing them on to other people, but for some reason they don't become ill. But if they're pathogens, they must, they're missing this logical step. If it's a pathogen, it must cause the disease.
Right.
And so if you're asymptomatic, you cannot be carrying a pathogen, nor can you pass it on. And again, we can go into contagion as well, because it's another part of it. But yes, the idea that somebody can have some kind of pathogen in their body and then pass it on to somebody else, it has been such a major part of the last couple of years. And that's really part of the story, part of the narrative, to make people stay in this state of fear, because that's, again, a major aspect of what's been going on, to keep people in fear of catching something that they can then pass on, even though, as you say, they're not ill. There's so much that's part of this story, that it's obviously not just, it's not about health, but it's about controlling people and keeping them in a state of fear, and then being able to control their behaviors, to keep them away from other people and to keep them separated, and in the true meaning of the word, isolated, keeping them isolated, right, away from other people. Because then, when people gather and get together and talk to each other, there's more likely the kind of conversations that will happen where people say, I'm not really sure about all of this. And other people say, I'm not sure either. But if we're all kept, we weren't, but if lots of people are kept separate, then they aren't able to have this communication with other people and connection. And so they think it might only be them, but they have to carry on listening to the others, listening to the so-called experts, following the rules, that kind of thing. So yes, it's a shame that so many people started believing in this mythology right at the beginning of 2020. And it's amazing how quickly behavior, those sorts of behaviors then become habit, to the point where people have said that they couldn't possibly not wear their mask, not wear their muzzle, as I call it, not wear their mask. It's just, they're used to it now, so they just put it on. It's now a habit. But another aspect is the fact that they're the people who absolutely believe in this narrative are then doing the job of some of the other kind of authorities, because they're now telling their other people around them who are not conforming, shall we say, who are not following these orders. So they're now the ones who are, if you like, shaming people who aren't following. So that there's so many aspects of this. But again, it starts with some ideas that are not based in any kind of science whatsoever, because there's no evidence for the existence of a pathogenic particle that has been called a virus. And in fact, a lot of what we've been looking at, and when we were researching, we realized that we had to actually look at the origins of words. And the origin of the word virus is from the Latin for poison. It's never been a little creature that's supposed to go around and infect people and make them ill. It's poison. And that actually is much closer to one of the real causes of people becoming ill, as David said, is sort of exposure to toxin, right. Poison. So again, this is the real meaning of the word virus, but it's been completely misrepresented and now completely redefined, like the word isolation for virologists. It now means some kind of infectious agent, but that is a myth, because these particles that are called viruses that are seen under the electron microscope as a result of these cell culture experiments, they have never been observed to do anything. In fact, they're not living, they're not alive, they don't perform any of the functions that allow them to, under sort of biology, they don't have the functions that can be defined, that can define them as a living organism. They don't eat, excrete, respire, reproduce, even though they're supposed to replicate inside a cell. That has never been actually seen. It's an assumption. So much of this is an assumption. So as you say, these mythologies start from a basic assumption that has never been proven, and then they've been allowed to create this story, this narrative that has gone out over the past 2 years, that has become embedded in so many people's sort of belief system. And it is just a belief system, and it's made it very difficult for them to realize that they've been deceived, that they've been the sort of subject of this deception. And it's very difficult for people to it's easier to I can't remember that quote now, but sort of but for people to accept that they've been deceived, it's very hard, because it's it's a sort of a problem to overcome.
Although it's this whole nonsense has reached a height over this last 2 years with dire consequences for the world. Of course, we had to investigate the whole of what we might think of as Western medical practices over the last 150 years, right from the early stages of forming the germ theory. And,
in fact, I wanted you guys to go into that a little bit, because I've heard you talk about Louis Pasteur and the doctors that, the professors and the scientists that were opposite of him. So I know there's some names out there. I don't have the recall right now to bring them up, but we know that this mythology kind of started around that period of time. You want to go into that?
Yeah, I mean, the two main protagonists really are, as you said, Louis Pasteur, the French. He was a chemist, actually. He wasn't a doctor or even a proper scientist. He was a chemist. And Robert Koch, a German microbiologist. And these are the two main people, really. I mean, and there's the Robert Koch Institute in Germany, and the Pasteur Institute in France, of course. So they're very much lauded and lionized within the medical establishment as being pillars of Western medicine. But when you look into their work and their history, you realize that they're nothing of the sort. And Louis Pasteur in particular was, many people who've looked into his work can see that he was a complete fraud. I mean, he's been credited with all sorts of things, but his papers after he died, which he'd actually wanted to be destroyed, but fortunately they didn't. So enough of them survived for people to really see what he was about. And it became quite obvious that much of what he'd done was fraudulent anyway. And with Robert Koch, I mean, although he's sort of famous for, which most people may have heard of, Koch's postulates, which are a set of rules which are supposed to be gold standards for the medical establishment, but they fly in the face of them all the time when it doesn't suit them. As Dawn was saying earlier about asymptomatic carriers, well, I mean, that's a complete contradiction to Koch's postulates, which says, and I think it's in the first postulate, that anyone with a disease, the germ should always be found in that person. And if they haven't got the disease, you should never find the germ in that person. And yet modern medicine is trying to tell us, oh, yes, no, you can have a person with the germ, but they're not sick, they're asymptomatic and can carry the germ and give it to someone else. And it's just nonsense. It's a myth that's created really by modern medicine and flies in the face of their own gold standards, Koch's postulate.
Right. Wow.
So where did the terrain? I know you corrected us to say it's not theory, but I'm not sure how to label it necessarily. But can you give us its origins and its sort of like basic sort of tenets of what makes it up and where it comes from and who's behind that?
Okay. Well, it's obviously much older than sort of the germ theory and modern medicine. Western medicine, which is probably only about 150 years old, whereas the idea of the terrain of the body and how it responds to its environment goes back thousands of years. I mean, it's sort of embedded in ancient Eastern medicines, and so its origins can go back much further. And as Dawn had said, in truth, it's not a theory, it's proven by fact, that as we often say, in short, only the body can heal itself. And providing you give it the right abilities to do that, which is the main two really, is the correct level of nutrition and to avoid toxic intake. It's important what you put both in and on your body. And of course, that's more difficult today because of, even just the cleaning products in the home or cosmetics, personal care products, the stuff you may get to the doctor if you're unfortunate enough to want to go and see one. So we're subject nowadays in the modern world to far more toxins than ever before. It's in our drinking water, it's chlorine and fluoride gets put in. Also, of course, in drinking water, because the filtration plants at source are not very good. So you get all sorts of other things in there, pharmaceutical products which are not filtered out, agricultural products, pesticides, insecticides, which are not totally filtered out. So you're getting trace elements, heavy metals, all of these things are in your drinking water. So it's hardly surprising that people get sick. And so we always recommend that one of the first things people need to do is make sure their water is clean, so that whatever they drink and cook their food in is actually clean. And so we recommend people either have a distiller or a reverse osmosis system, which is a set of filters which take everything out of the water. And that's the only way you can be sure that what you're drinking is clean and you're not slowly poisoning yourself. So these are basic things with food, which is the source of nutrition, which the body needs to be able to, for its mechanisms to work properly, shall we say, because the body needs to be able to, if it comes into contact with certain toxins, it needs to be able to deal with them. Okay. Now, to be able to deal with them, it's dependent on the body being in a healthy state through the nutrition, the food that you eat. That's what gives it its, not only its energy, but its ability to flush out toxic material. Now, again, in today's modern world, nutritious food is not as easy to come by as it ought to be. Even going down to the local supermarket and buying what looks like nice fruit and veg may be not grown in a good environment. It could have been sprayed with various chemicals, pesticides, grown in soils which are fairly depleted of natural minerals. And so for these reasons, we say as much as possible, if people can eat organic food, because it's less likely to have been sprayed with anything toxic, and it's more likely to have been grown in soil which has all the natural minerals in it, because the plants can uptake those minerals and convert them into organic format, which your body can then assimilate. I know people often think, oh, well, I can just take some multivitamins from my local shop. But very often those things are in an inorganic format, and the body can't assimilate them. So they basically just go straight through your system. They don't do any good at all. They just reduce your bank balance. That's about all they're good for. So your nutrition has to come from food. I mean, Dawn and I are both vegans. We prefer to call ourselves plant-based. Now, I know that's not for everyone, but it's really what we've found to be the healthiest diet. And I know that a lot of people say, oh yes, I know I can go down the supermarket and I can buy lots of packets of stuff which say vegan on it. Well, that's not going to do you any good, because it's just mass-produced processed food. And, it's not got the level of nutrition in it that's going to keep you healthy.
Right.
Sorry.
Are you I'm going to ask this on behalf of my mother, who manages a health area of a grocery chain in Florida, and it's all organic foods and supplements. Are you against supplements in general? Because I take supplements
it's
pretty
just
regularly.
No, that's a fair question. I mean, I've been asked this before, and I can only speak from personal experience. I mean, I've been meat free, if you like, and supplement free for over 50 years. I'm 72, and I've never taken supplements. I've only relied on good food, and I'm fit and healthy, and I know there's thousands more like me. We talk to plant-based people all around the world, and it's thousands of years old. It's not some new food fad that's only coming. Pythagoras was a vegan, and that's 2,500 years ago, so it's a good start. So it's what we found to be healthy. You don't have to eat meat. I know that a lot of people enjoy it, but what we're saying is fine, but you don't have to eat it, and we're living proof that you don't have to eat it. And so then the ethical side comes in. Well, if you don't have to have animals killed, why do it? And that's another portion of it, really, which is quite important to us. And I'm not making moral judgments on people. I'm just stating where we are with it. So we found that one, it's the healthiest diet that we could come across, and there's lots of evidence to show this, which we won't go into now. But also the ethical side of don't kill things if you don't need to, and it's as simple as that, really.
Right. So, and that's basically the way we live as well.
He doesn't eat meat.
For like 35 years. So
Well, there you go. As you say, living proof that you don't need to eat it. You don't need it. Right. Some people will say that you do, and we know some doctors that say that you have to, because there's certain things you need to get from meat, but there is nothing that you need from meat that you can't get from plants. There is nothing. And so a proper balanced diet, plant-based diet, and I do stress that it's no good thinking you can just live on apples and tomatoes or something. It's go for as many. Sorry.
Yeah. No, I'm sorry to interrupt, but what about vitamins? What about, sometimes we take like a magnesium, calcium drink right before we go to bed. What about stuff like that? Is that okay?
Well, all I can say is I've never found the need for it. So
I see.
If you eat a nutritious diet, everything is there that you need, and it's Mother Nature packages it in the best way that's the most beneficial and most easily assimilated for the body, because that's the natural way of living. We all manage perfectly well for hundreds of thousands of years, long before the pharmaceutical companies came on the market with their stores, you know. So we know that we can manage perfectly well. And as I say, I'm living proof, Dawn's living proof, and many thousands of other people are living proof that you don't need to eat meat and you don't need to take supplements. But if certain people, and you know, I appreciate this could be so, if they are not getting a totally nutritious diet, and that their diet is deficient, as you mentioned, zinc or magnesium, and I'll give reasons why in a minute. If they're not getting those in their food for some reason, they may need to take something. You know, they may need magnesium in particular is something that people do tend to have a shortage of, and that's because the plants, if they're not organically grown, the soils that they're grown in are depleted in, for instance, magnesium. So the plants are not taking up that particular element, and so are not passing it on when you eat them to the human recipients, if you like. So that's why, again, we stress that to try and get organically grown food, because the Soil Association is involved in it before you can stick the label of organic on your product, certainly in the UK anyway. The soil has to be shown to be healthy.
Right.
So that means that all those natural minerals and that are in there, and then they go into the plant and then into you. So again, that keeps you healthy. Okay.
In terms
I have another.
Go ahead.
No,
Go ahead, Dawn.
Yes, just sort of adding to what David was saying about, you know, when some people are maybe their bodies are sort of completely out of balance and they need something to help them. I mean, yes, there are possibly occasions where supplements are helpful, but there are so many supplements that are made by pharmaceutical companies, by the pharmaceutical industry. You have to be careful because, again, you have to look at the form that the supplements are in to make sure that they are actually bioavailable, and that, which means that your body's going to absorb it. If they are just pharmaceutical chemicals, the chances are your body is not going to absorb them, so you're not going to get the benefits. Now, there are I believe, I mean, I don't know, a small percentage of the supplements that are out there are actually properly food-based, and they may be more bioavailable, they may be more helpful, but again, these should not be used instead of food. You know, that they're not to replace, you know, well, I can carry on eating my sort of, you know, burgers and chips or whatever and just take a few supplements that'll make me healthy. It's, you know, if you're out of balance and you need some kind of rebalancing, you know, your body's out of homeostasis, that can help rebalance, but as not as an ongoing regular sort of daily habit, because then you're relying on the supplement rather than looking at everything else that your body you may need to look at to address the problem. So it's, again, nutrition, toxins, EMFs, but also the kind of mental, emotional sort of stress, like, you know, like the fear that's been going around at, you know, people are, if they realize that there's nothing to be afraid of, then their bodies are not going to be as stressed. And so because there are quite a few adverse effects when you're under stress, you know, you're not sleeping well, and that can obviously have all kinds of detrimental effects. So again, it's not to say, you know, don't supplement, but if you're going to really have a look at the source, but also only look at it as a sort of short-term top up, not as a replacement for true nutrition, which comes from food.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because one of the things that why nutrition is also important is the body naturally produces throughout the stresses of the day things called free radicals. Okay, and these are, in electronics terms, they're ions, so they're depleted of an electron, so they become like scavengers in the body. And if they're not flushed out, they can damage the body at cellular level, and if not eradicated, even down to organ level. But the body's nutrition, when you're eating your good mix of fruit and vegetables, absorbs them, and that's because it produces antioxidants. So when your food's got lots of colors in it, red and greens and things like that, it means it's rich in antioxidants, and antioxidants will flush out these free radicals, and the body works like this all the time. But if you get an imbalance, either a great increase of free radicals from stress or from toxic material entering the body, and a depletion of antioxidants because your nutrition levels are not good enough, you can see that then you get an imbalance in the body, in the terrain of your body, and illness occurs. Now the first symptoms might be what people often refer to as a cold. So you get the sort of congestion and runny eyes and all the rest of it, headaches. Now this is a detox symptom. There's no such thing as a cold caused by a virus or a germ. It's the body detoxing, and so that should be a clue to people. If they get a so-called cold, their body is trying to detox. It's trying to get rid of something toxic. So you've let your body get out of balance in some way, either by not having enough of the correct nutrition or a greater intake of toxic material than your body can cope with. So it's had to step up a gear and call in the mucous membranes, which are trying to help the body get rid of this toxic material. So don't then, what people often make the mistake of, let's go to the chemist and take something to try and stop those symptoms. Let's try and get a decongestant. And what they're doing then is they're fighting the body. The body's trying to get rid of stuff, and they're trying to stop it doing it. And at the same time, adding more toxic material from the pharmaceutical products. And this happens all the time. When the medical establishment intervene, if you like, in the body's natural processes, even a fever. When the body raises its temperature, that's part of a healing process. But what do the medical establishment think? You should reduce that fever, take something to reduce the fever. So again, they're putting the body into conflict. The body's trying to do its job, and the pharmaceutical companies are trying to stop it. And it's that sort of syndrome that carries on through a lot of symptoms are generally the body trying to detox itself. And depending on what has caused those symptoms, what the toxic material is, or the stress levels, or the EMFs, or whatever it is, will determine what type of symptoms you get. But the one thing that we're always sure of, because we spent 10 years trying to find it, is it's never anything to do with a germ. It's always something to do with those four factors. And invariably, it's the first two. It's the lack of nutrition and a high level of toxic intake. And those are quite often the main two. And we tested this theory, if you like, out on animal illnesses as well. And we found exactly the same. Whenever animals were ill, we found, and with animals, it was generally toxins and lack of proper nutrition. Those were the two main things. Although animals can be stressed too, and that can, and of course they can be affected by EMFs. So all the same things, but quite predominantly it was toxins, because lots of farm animals and that are vaccinated, aren't they? They probably get more vaccines than humans. So it's and they don't get fed the proper food.
Now, did you have a question?
Oh, well, I have a couple of questions, but I also want to talk about the website, because it's such a beautiful website. Let me and I think that people should know where they can find you, because we're almost at the hour mark, and we haven't even talked about your book yet. We haven't talked about the website. So let's at least bring that up if our computer will.
I'm getting a roller. I usually don't get a spinner. Oh, it's asking me for something else. Let me see here. Hang on a second.
Can you incorporate the?
I'll get it. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So we love your website. We really think that that's a good place for people to start. I think it's right there.
Yeah.
There you go.
There's the homepage.
It's really great. It's one of the better ones that we've seen where, this is sort of our wheelhouse, our background.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, yeah, this is a really good website.
Yeah.
Where do you think, if people were going to go to your website, where should they go first?
Well, I think if they're not familiar with us or just want to find out a little bit more about us, I mean, along that top row there's a little click link called videos, and they can click on that and see all the different interviews that we've done with where people have interviewed us around the world, and so they can get to see what we talk about and what questions we get asked. So that's a good place. I mean, eventually this one will be on there as well, and people will be able to see it. And they can go along there. There's
also the blog before videos. There's blog where we've got a number of articles on some of the basic concepts like the germ theory, immunity and antibodies and
HIV.
And the latest one is because of the whole new HIV variant apparently. So I recently put up an article on that because, again, just to show it's more fear mongering. The one below, the contagion and infection, because again, contagion is something that people keep asking us about, but if it's not a virus, why are people ill at the same time? There are 2 articles on COVID, just because, our book came out on Christmas Eve 2019, so just before all of this. So we don't mention coronavirus or COVID in the book at all. Sure. So some people said, what do you think about COVID? So again, we put up a couple of articles to cover that as well. Within the articles, there are references, so there are other places to go to show with the sources of the information in that article. I mean, they're fairly sort of brief overviews, but hopefully enough information for people to be able to get a fairly good idea. We try to be as concise as possible about the points. There's lots and lots of information, but we try to cut through the reams of information to give people the basic understanding and to make the point as clearly as possible that there's no evidence for any pathogenic agents, so there's no need to be afraid. So again, a few different articles on a different topic. So if people like to read, but there are upwards of, I don't know, about 70 different videos.
Yeah. But there's lots of information there, and also as they run along there, they can see that we now have an audio version of our book.
I noticed that. Yeah, I saw that.
Wow.
Yeah.
So we had a lot of requests to produce an audio version. So we have. Wow. And so for those who want to listen to it while they're jogging or in the car, they can now download it and listen to it wherever they like.
That's terrific.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Wow.
So there's the introduction that people can listen to free, so they can hear, get an idea of what it sounds like, and then click through to buy it. So yeah, that's directly available through the website.
That's great.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the better websites we've seen.
Oh, thank you. Very kind.
I'll pass that on to our website designer. I'm afraid neither of us can take the credit for that. But there's also a newsletter that people can subscribe to, that we put out just at ad hoc basis, just when there's something new, either some more information to pass out to people or some new articles or new things that we've put up on the website. So it's an occasional thing. It's not a regular, but we just sort of share information, and because people like to know what's going on and they ask us different things, so it's a central place where we can just send out information.
What we do remind people is we're under the law, we're not allowed to be to advise specific medical problems that people might have. We're not, we're not allowed by law to do that. So we can only point people in certain directions. We can give them information like we do in the book. I mean, we investigated lots and lots of different diseases, all the ones that people are most familiar with, and we're quite clear as to what the causes of those diseases are. none of which are germs, anything to do with germs.
Right.
So we can be quite clear about that. And in the back of our book, there are lots of references. So all our work is fully referenced, so people can follow up on those references if they wish to do some further research themselves.
That's
so,
great.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to go into at least one or two, maybe two. Let's do one at least. Example, and people are always, and we've listened to your interviews before, so people are like, what about this disease, what about that disease? And the one that always seems to come up, and I loved your explanation of it, is the bubonic plague, the Black Plague in Europe. Like thousands of people died, or how many ever people died. And I loved your story around that, because it's like, oh, it has nothing to do with what we're told it is. So, can you go into that again for us?
Sure, yeah. It's it is quite interesting. And we while we were doing our research, because we were obviously researching all the diseases people are most common with, and so we, in a way, tried to catch ourselves out and think, oh, is there some occasion that doesn't fit this mold, that we were finding, that germs don't make you ill? And so we thought, right, let's try the Black Death. That was, so we did. And cutting a long story short, because we spent quite a lot of time on it, because we were told at school, as I'm sure you were, that the Black Death was caused by infected rat fleas jumping off rats and onto humans and infecting them, and then they died this horrible death, and that it killed millions of people all across Europe in particular. So we thought, well, this would be a good one to have a look at. Anyway, what we found, we did come across some work by Professor Mike Bailey in a university in Ireland, and he'd written a book called New Light on the Black Death. So I thought, well, that'll be interesting to have a look at. Now, Professor Mike Bailey is retired now, but he was a dendrochronologist, which is someone who studies tree rings. So you might think, what's that got to do with the Black Death? But what he found, of course, being a dendrochronologist, trees live a very long time, some thousands of years. I think the oldest is about 5,000 years. So it was easy to find tree rings, that were alive at the time of the Black Death. And so by examining the tree rings, he could see that during that period, the tree rings were much narrower, which shows that the trees were not getting the same levels of nutrition, back to nutrition again, for them to grow properly. So he knew that there was what he called a climatic trough, something had happened within the environment. Okay, so what he decided to do was cross-reference the tree rings with ice core samples, and sure enough, they supported what he was finding, that something had happened to the climate, and the ice core samples were able to show that the atmosphere had become very toxic, in particular with ammonia. Now, that's very deadly, and if you inhale that, you can be dead in seconds. So he then also looked at the sort of eyewitness accounts of people who were alive at that time, and look at what they were saying. And it became quite clear that they were reporting, in their words, a thick and stinking and choking atmosphere. Okay, and they reported that a strange dust had settled on the ground and on the vegetation. They also reported that in the rivers and lakes, that the shoals of fish were floating to the surface dead. Well, obviously you can see that none of this is anything to do with rat fleas, is it? Particularly fish all dying. Yeah. So you can quite see that something else had happened. Now, on further examination, and I'm being brief on all of this, it also transpired that at that time there was some violent or a violent earthquake, quite a massive one, and various volcanic eruptions. Now, whenever the earth opens up, of course, all sorts of toxic material gets ejected into the atmosphere, including toxic gases like ammonia. So all these started to add up, and also none of the eyewitness accounts at the time reported large rat die-offs, because, as we're told, the fleas, the infected fleas, which are living on the rats, would kill the rats, because and then jump off their dead host onto a human being. So you would have expected there to be thousands of dead rats everywhere, but there are no eyewitness accounts that substantiate that. So again, the picture starts to grow that there is definitely something else. Now, some further research that we did, looking into what was happening in Europe at the time with some other writers, we found that sure enough, there had been this climatic change, quite drastic, so much so that there were huge crop failures all across Europe, particularly Northern Europe, and people were starving to death and were starting to try and migrate further south. And things were so bad that the records show that people were resorting to cannibalism. They were literally eating one another. They were even taking down corpses from the gallows to eat, so that you can tell how bad things were. So put all these things together and you can see why there was mass die-off of people. Again, nothing to do with infected rat fleas. And then in more later times, here in London, in the UK, some archaeologists were doing some excavations in London in what was supposed to have been one of the plague areas, and they expected to be able to find evidence for the rat die-offs, but there wasn't. There was nothing there. So again, all of this evidence comes together and says that it's nothing to do with rats, it's nothing to do with infected rat fleas, it's to do with a large and poisonous climatic change, a toxic atmosphere, which was actually killing people. They were literally dropping down dead in the streets, and this was what is supported by the eyewitness accounts. So that's a potted version of the Black Death, and shows that it was nothing to do with an infection. It was to do with a toxic atmosphere brought about by these climatic changes. So again,
well, it's amazing how the stories get changed throughout history, and and these legends occur through just like misinformation or people conflating one thing with another, like the whole idea of like the rats, and it's like just making up a theory and then going with that, and then that becomes the story, right? And I think go ahead.
We found the same when we investigated the 1918 supposed flu epidemic. Again, it was nothing to do with a virus or a bacteria, and there was lots of other elements to it as to what was actually killing people. But what we found by looking at all these supposed plagues that we're told about is it fits in with a narrative that the authorities, they wish to keep going, because if they can support the idea of mass infections, pandemics, of course, and look to the past, and point out, oh, well, we had it with the 1918 flu. Oh, look, we had it with the Black Death. If they can point to these sorts of things, even though none of them are true, but the public doesn't know that, it's much easier to sell the idea of present day pandemics, isn't it? Whether it's HIV or swine flu or COVID, they can sell this idea of pandemics, but there is no scientific evidence, and we searched for 10 years to find any scientific evidence to prove there is any such thing. People die for all sorts of reasons. People can be poisoned, and there's all sorts of reasons why people die, but none of them are anything to do with a germ. And that's the real thing to take away from this, which is a great shock. And that's why the subtitle of our book is Why Everything You Thought You Knew About Disease is Wrong, because we were brought up to believe germs made you ill, that vaccinations were good for you, that they would provide immunity against these germs. And none of that is true. There is no scientific evidence to prove that. In fact, all the evidence, historical and scientific, shows just the opposite, that there's no such thing as a safe and effective vaccine, that germs do not make you ill. There's all sorts of other reasons, all of which we talk about in the book, and that doctors are not evil people. They're just miseducated, mistrained for all sorts of reasons, mostly to do with finances. And the whole medical establishment is not based on science, which is what we were all led to believe. When you
Right.
look for the actual science, it's not there. And this is the big beef that ourselves and other doctors, which are now starting to speak out, are challenging the medical establishment and indeed the legal establishment to prove that a virus is the cause of COVID. And no one has ever done it. And the authorities are doing their best to keep any of these cases out of court, because they know that once it gets into court, it will be obvious to everyone that there is no such thing as a pathogenic virus. And that's a big shock to people.
Yeah. Well, it's funny how we, we both lived in San Francisco at the time of the AIDS so-called pandemic or whatever crisis they used to use the word.
Yeah.
I was there in my early 20s. You were growing up in the Bay Area, and so we saw all that stuff firsthand. And these men, wasting away, and we started putting together the similarities between the marketing campaign known as COVID and the marketing campaign known as HIV/AIDS, and started seeing those correlations and and the same people, behind those marketing campaigns, but also, then we heard you speak, talk about that period of time and where that wasting disease and where the whole thing kind of formed from, and how these authorities sort of chose a vulnerable population to expose and to exploit for their own means and their own benefit. It's pretty remarkable.
And much like what we experienced in the age of COVID, like what we had, I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we just left 3 years ago. So at the time, Dianne Feinstein was mayor of San Francisco, and there was a big real estate acquisition going on as these, huge populations of gay men were suddenly dying. So the market was manipulated to sell their beautiful homes in the Castro district for, on the cheap, while these, men were dying. And you were probably the only other ones outside of a few fringy blog posts that I'd read and things that I believed my whole life that said it had to do with poppers. It had to do with, that they were, and JP and I talk about this a lot. They were, it's a lifestyle, you don't have to be judgmental, whatever. That's how they live,
And of course, the treatment, we talk about this, as in our book, because that was the sort of first disease, if we want to call it that we examined in depth to find out what it was. And without, unless you want me to, without going into too much detail about the scam of the HIV, very tragic. But yes, I mean, the small gay community as it was in San Francisco at the time, yes, as you quite rightly said, they used poppers, a drug which is actually amyl nitrate, which is very toxic to the body, although you can get a high and it's a muscle relaxant. And this, of course, because it's toxic to the body, was making the guys ill. And then they were going to the doctors, who were then giving them sort of antiviral medication, antibiotics, and which just made them worse, because antibiotics is toxic. Why it's called antibiotics, which means anti-life. the clues in the name.
Well, the theory is that they kill bacteria, but I mean,
but they're toxic to the body. That's the main thing. So they were getting a double whammy.
So of course they'll kill bacteria, right?
Yeah. So the guys were carrying on with their amyl nitrate poppers and now taking antibiotics, and were not getting better, of course. And so the medical establishment, in their wisdom, decided they needed some stronger medication, because they thought they must be facing a new germ, a new virus. And so they pulled off the shelves AZT, or AZT as it's known in the States, which was actually a chemotherapy drug, which was taken off the market because it was so toxic. So naturally, they thought they'd try to bring it back off the shelves and try it out on these poor guys. And we've had this confirmed from a doctor that everyone who took that level of AZT at the time, every single person died, every single one. And this includes people like Freddie Mercury and Rudolf Nureyev and others, Arthur Ashe. It killed them all because it was so toxic. And so they started to reduce the dose, which just meant it killed people slower. But mainly people were dying. They were dying of the treatment. And of course, we get the same when we investigated cancer. Chemotherapy is extremely toxic. Radiotherapy is extremely toxic, and it kills people because the medical establishment doesn't understand what cancer is, so-called cancer. So we talk about all these things. And yes, you're quite right. We have an exact parallel. We're old enough to have lived through the 80s too, so we know what it was. We didn't know what we know now, but it's became quite obvious to us. And the parallels between what was going off in the 80s and what's been going off with COVID, and as you quite rightly say, some of the same people, like Fauci, we have to say, was involved in the HIV first scam, and he's involved in the COVID scam, and hardly surprising, really. So, and what is worrying and why we've started to talk about HIV again is because they're trying to bring it back again, aren't they? And say that there's a new virulent HIV virus and everyone's got to go and get tested against to see whether, so it's just the same old story again about making money and costing people's lives. There's no two ways about it.
Well, it was interesting. Right before the COVID thing happened and we moved to Pittsburgh, like she said, 3 years ago, I hadn't seen an ad for getting tested for HIV in years. Even in the Castro district,
in San Francisco,
in the Castro district in San Francisco, suddenly these ads were on the buses in Pittsburgh and all over the place. And
what is this about?
And wow, that's really a thing still. What's going on? And again, I think it was just a lead up to where we are now.
I have a personal story that I want to just mention to you guys. So as late as 1994, I was 23 years old, living in San Francisco. And I had some friends and, at the time I didn't really think about it, but going back now, what is it? Almost 30 years later, I'm realizing that so much of how people are behaving regarding the COVID marketing is the same way that people behaved even after the AIDS marketing supposedly went away. People are still going and getting tested. So I knew somebody in 1994. He was a cyclist. He was the pinnacle of health. Typical Californian, perfect shape, blonde hair, blue eyes, gay man. He was I think he was an attorney, very, beautiful home in the Castro district, was going and regularly getting tested, which is what people do there. Like people go and regularly get tested for COVID now when they don't really need to. They just do it automatically, so it's become this part of your life. And he got tested for HIV, was told he was HIV positive, and within a year he was dead because of all of the medications they put him on. And I watched him waste away. I watched him go from being this really healthy, strong young man in his 30s to at least, 30, 35. I watched, and his partner had to carry him up and down the stairs. And then I watched him waste away over a year. And at the time I thought, oh, wow, that's weird because he was so healthy. I guess you never know, right? And we all just kind of went, well, you never know.
Right.
Well, now in retrospect, I realized that they killed him. And it just so happened that they lived in a beautiful, Victorian that his partner had to sell on the cheap. Like it was the classic example of a fraud and politics and corporate real estate acquisition and all of it wrapped in one little story. And so now my concern is that people are doing the same thing regarding COVID, is they're going out and getting tested when they don't need to. This is really scary to me. And then what if they get a false positive,
Well, anything that reads positive on either an HIV test or a COVID test is meaningless.
It's false.
It's false, because there is no, again, that's why we emphasize this point so strongly. There is no evidence for any pathogenic virus, which means that tests are meaningless, because there's nothing that they can detect in the body that is pathogenic. But as you say, this test that arbitrarily shows up something that then is claimed to show that it's positive, that it's read as positive. And again, the reasons for that are because of the way the tests are designed. And again, if it's a PCR test, to do with the number of cycles that they go through, and the more cycles, the more chance it is for reading positive. So again, they've been ramping that up with COVID, and again, they were using the same tests for HIV. So as you say, plenty of parallels, but that's why it is so important for people to know there is no pathogenic virus. Therefore, there is no reason to take a test, and just because a test shows as positive, there is no correlation with any kind of health problem. And your friend being absolutely healthy and receiving this positive test is a case in point. Absolutely healthy, no reason to think that he had any kind of illness, and yet as soon as he started what's called treatment, his health deteriorated. But again, in the 90s, that's when the doses of AZT were extremely high and basically lethal. So yes,
we've also
tragic, absolutely tragic.
We've also come across cases where, and this was from a doctor. Obviously, I'm not going to name the doctor, but who believed in HIV, who believed in the HIV test. And one of his patients, young man, he had to tell him that his test, the doctor had to tell this young man that he tested positive for HIV. And within a couple of days, the guy had committed suicide. These are the tragedies that have, and that's not an isolated case. It's very difficult. I mean, I know that a lot of these doctors are doing it purely out of ignorance. And this particular doctor, it was out of ignorance. He did what he thought was right, using a test which is completely, as we know, completely invalid. But that gave a death sentence to this young man who committed suicide rather than live with the fact that he was going to develop AIDS or infect his partner or whatever. And that's happened thousands of times all around the world. Sorry.
No, go ahead. Finish your thought.
I was going to say, we've heard similar reports with the COVID thing, where people have committed suicide because they either thought they'd got it or might get it, and that the world was now turning into such a terrible place, they no longer wanted to be in it. And the suicide rates, and we've had this confirmed to us by doctors and funeral directors, suicide rates had gone up tremendously, and frightening, yes, in young people as well. 15-year-olds committing suicide. This is just dreadful. The perpetrators of this, well, I don't know what to call it really. The perpetrators of this whole scamdemic are monsters of the first order. I can call them nothing else because they know full well what they're doing. I'm not talking about your everyday doctors, the people who have instigated this. They are monsters of the first order. And, if there's any justice in the world at all, they will get their comeuppance, and very soon. But the people of the world have got to realize the truth of this and stop succumbing and acquiescing to the lies that they're being told, which are being pumped out by governments, either knowingly or unknowingly, or by the media, either knowingly or unknowingly. But all these people are complicit in the deaths of, millions of people worldwide. And this is a huge tragedy, and we've got to bring it to a stop as quickly as possible. And only the everyday people can do that by coming together, if you like. I'm not talking about violence or armed insurrection. I'm talking about just saying no, not complying with it. And that's all they have to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the most important word that we all have to, really learn to use, I think, is the best way to put it.
Yeah. We
You know?
spoke to Dr. Larry Pilevsky. He's a holistic pediatrician. And he says we all need to tap into our toddler self. Toddlers like to investigate, and they have no fear, and they say no a lot.
and they ask why a lot.
Yeah, when
Mhm.
they
They
get
ask
older.
why a lot, exactly.
People are not asking questions.
Yeah.
Right.
They're just bowing to these so-called experts, and they are not experts.
No.
They're just authorities. And
That's right.
Yeah. And as we've always said, this is a marketing campaigin, and a very lethal one at that.
It is.
Yeah.
It's a very lethal one.
Yeah.
I have a couple, just a question before we wrap up. This is kind of just off the cuff. Before we started, you said that there was a lot of rain. And it's cloudy and rainy where you live because you live in the UK. And I heard a statistic that in Pittsburgh, which is where we live now, we had one of the lowest levels of vitamin D in the country, in the United States. So and we know that vitamin D comes from the sun. So how do you get vitamin D when there's so much rain and sky cover, cloud cover, sun cover, which is what we have?
It doesn't rain every day. There are some days where, I know England's got the reputation of being, sort of raining all the time. But I mean, we do get some sunshine even through the winter as well. So yes, it's possible to get out and get some sunshine.
And of course, just being outside when it's daylight, I mean, there is still exposure to the sun, although you can't see it. And fortunately, like vitamin C, you don't need a lot of it. And the body can sort of store up vitamin D, as it were. It's the body actually produces it from sunlight. The sunlight encourages the body to produce it. So, and it can store it. Unlike vitamin C, which you can't store, and so you need to keep replenishing it. But again, you don't need vast amounts of it. And you can get all of that from your vitamin C, that is, from your fruit and vegetables. But yes, you need to expose yourself to sunlight and take advantage when you can, when the sun's out. Don't smother your skin with pharmaceutical products, suntan lotion. That's another good gimmick, isn't it? Be afraid of the sun. Buy our products and slime it all over your body.
I even heard a friend of mine say that even when wearing sunglasses will affect your serotonin levels or something. And so lately when I've been going outside, I've just been wearing my glasses, not my sunglasses. And I'm like, oh yeah, I think it is helping my mood a little bit.
It does. It's very important. The body does take in through the eyes quite an amount of sunlight. So don't, many ancient cultures practice sun gazing, which is literally looking at the sun, usually first thing in the morning, sunrise and sunset, when it's not at its full brightness, and it's something you have to build up to. But that's again very therapeutic and improves your eyesight. You may have noticed I don't actually wear glasses at all, and I've never worn glasses.
I think the three of us obviously need to practice a bit of something.
Right.
Well, I know why I'm wearing glasses. There's too much computer use under bad lighting.
Years and years of this tech.
But you can recover, you can, to a certain extent, through eye exercises. I mean, there's I think there was a book, trying to remember its title, written by an ophthalmist who surprisingly was trying to do himself out of a job because he was writing about how to improve your eyesight without glasses and through exercising the muscles. The eyes are muscles, aren't they, that contract and expand to focus the eyes. And that's why when they stop doing that very well, you have to wear glasses, because the eyes are not, the muscles are not expanding and contracting and behind your or in your eyeballs. I mean, so you can exercise them, by doing various eye exercises, and quite quickly it will start to improve your eyesight. And a bit of sun gazing, being careful to do it, all of these things, it's all natural stuff, which is really why we always, Don and I, talk about natural health, because, and we mean that, health is a natural thing. Being unhealthy is the unnatural thing. Being healthy is the natural
Right.
thing for the body. And if you just do and stick to a few simple rules, and they are fairly simple, with your nutrition and avoiding toxins and all the rest of it, as much as you can. We know it's not a perfect world, and you can't avoid all the toxins. But
you don't need to be perfect either.
No,
It's
no,
not a
you don't.
question of you got to be absolutely right with everything, because the body can tolerate a certain amount. But obviously you
Right.
need to restore the body to a certain level, and then it can kind of manage itself. It's you know, it's not, as I say, being perfect, but it's just being careful. And obviously if you minimize exposures to toxins, that's certainly quite important with what's going on from what we're being bombarded with, you know, from the skies and everything that we're exposed to. So if you minimize it, I mean, because you can't eliminate them all, but if you minimize it as much as you can, it's certainly going to help your body.
As we investigated the body and the terrain of the body, we found the body is a fantastic self-regulating organism. And if you just stick to the basic rules that we've talked about, it will look after itself. It knows how to do it better than any doctor or anyone else. And it will operate fine. It's natural health. So these are the things that we try to explain in our book and show people. You know, we don't tell people what to do, but we give them the information so they can make informed decisions. That's really where we come from. And so that people can live a long and healthy life, and without spending lots of money on medical treatment. So doctors don't like to hear that, of course.
Yeah. And that book is What Really Makes You Ill, Why Everything You Thought You Knew About Disease Is Wrong. And you can, as you can see here, you can get it on Amazon. Is there any other place that you can pick it up?
Well, there's quite a few online bookstores that you can buy it from. How many of them are owned by Amazon, I don't know. They keep buying them up, but there are a few. We don't sell directly the book ourselves, but we do sell directly the audio version of it. So you can only get the audio version directly from us. You can buy it off our website.
Okay.
There's a Kindle version of the book for those who want to download that way.
But that's obviously Amazon.
But of course, Kindle is owned by Amazon. So, you know, but you have a few choices. But as we know, all books end up on Amazon anyway. Choose who the publisher is. They always end up there. So, so that's it really. But do visit. I would recommend people, as you already have, to visit our website, because there's lots of free information there, and we'll help people without them having to spend a penny or a dime. So, okay.
Before we say goodbye, we want to show the website one more time. There we go.
Oh, well, that's a page
That's
on it.
a page on the website, but we
there
can go to the home page.
Right.
There.
Yeah.
So,
and that's whatreallymakesyouill.com, right?
Yep.
That's correct.
Yes.
Okay.
Perfect.
And we'll put that in the show notes.
Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely.
Thank you.
Yes. Anything else?
No, I think that's, you know, I think that's pretty much it. I mean, you guys, I mean, we could talk to you for 3 hours, as we've seen you do.
Right.
Because you're a fountain of information and very enjoyable to talk to. So we wanted to thank you very much for coming on and, you know, allowing us to introduce you to our audience and, you know, talk about, you know, what you know and talk about your book and all that. Anything else?
Just very quickly, do you feel that the 10 years of research that you did, where you really dug deep, do you feel that it's kind of paid off now? I mean, do you feel that you're seeing some benefits from it?
Yes, I mean, we think so, because as Dawn said earlier, the book purely, well, coincidentally, we don't really believe in coincidence. I mean, it was released at Christmas 2019. And we all know what happened in 2020, right at the beginning.
Right.
COVID hit the world. So we believe the book was meant to be. You know, these things are guided, aren't they? And the book was meant to be. And of course, because we and no one else had heard of COVID or coronavirus, so by name, it's not mentioned in the book. So that's prevented our book being pulled off the shelves, which had happened to a lot of other publishers, authors who'd written COVID, hoax, and all things like that in the title of the book. and so it got banned. They all got banned by Amazon, but ours didn't, because it doesn't mention COVID at all. But of course, everything that's in the book shows that COVID is just another name given to another fictitious virus that doesn't exist and doesn't make people ill.
But when you say about worth it, I mean, one of the most heartwarming things, I think I can speak for both of us, is when people say that having read our book, it's really helped them to understand and to take back responsibility for their health. And that for us is the key.
Makes it worthwhile.
Well, I mean, certainly makes it worthwhile, but that is the key message for people to take responsibility for themselves. Not always easy for people, but the fact that they've said yes and it's really helped them, and that means everything to us, because that's what we were hoping it would do.
I mean, people have actually said that it's not only changed their lives with the information, but saved their lives, and that's you couldn't ask for any more than that, really. So we feel it's achieving its objective, really. I mean, it's been more successful than we dared hope, and because we thought we were going to get a real hammering from the medical establishment, but it never came. One or two tried to have a go at us, but we've just turned it back on them and said, well, show us your evidence. Show us where there is any scientific proof for this virus or that bacterium to cause the disease, and we'll shut up. But they've never been able to do that. They've never been able to do it. So they all just disappear. And so it's our perfect defense, really. Show us the evidence.
Yeah. Show us the evidence. Right. Exactly.
Right. Well, congratulations on that, for sure, on the success of the book, and also being able to, the timing, like you said, was just perfect. You did, and you left all of the keywords out. Not by design. It just so happened that it worked out that way. Yeah. Amazing. I think that you've been such a blessing to the community of, podcasters and doctors and, researchers. I know that I felt very, when I first heard you talk, especially when you were talking about the HIV/AIDS fraud, I felt very vindicated. I felt like, okay, finally, there's somebody out there who's got the platform and they're on the circuit and they're letting people know what this was really about. Finally, I feel like it's because of you guys that people are starting to really wake up about it. So it was really nice to see that.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's lovely to hear. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we're going to put you in the green room. We'll be right back. We're going to say goodbye to our audience. So thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Yeah. Sure, and we'll be right back with you.
Okay, great. Wow. Well, that was a great conversation.
It was one of our better ones.
Yeah, for sure.
We're really, really honored that they joined us today.
Yeah. And again, you can find their website, Don and David, in their book and their website in our show notes. So you can find it there. We want to, again, thank all our patrons on patreon.com. If you'd like to help out, you can do that. You can support this platform by going to patreon.com/bookofhours. You can also go to rockfin.com/bookofhours and become a member. A monthly subscription, or you can leave a tip in the tip jar. So that's a pretty awesome thing as well. Help us keep doing the work that we do.
Absolutely. You doing okay over there?
I'm doing okay. I think I swallowed wrong a moment ago, so my eyes are tearing up a little bit and kind of dealing with that. But other than that,
we had a great talk, and we can't wait to continue to have more conversations like this. We've got some really good people coming up in the future, so stay tuned for that.
All right, cool. All right, well, we'll see you next time on the next Pullquote.
Thanks, guys.
All right,
bye-bye.
By the way.
Yeah? What is it?
I stole this idea from Ken Nordine.
It's a good one.
Pullquote is made possible by our patrons and supporters.
That's patreon.com/bookofhours.
Right, and you can also join Rockfin or leave us a tip.
Oh, right, rockfin.com/bookofhours.
Thank you.
Oh, and thank you.